We are talking about amphibians, and then specifically amphibians of Pennsylvania. My name is Nick Stallman. I work with Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania as a wildlife habitat educator. I absolutely love amphibians, so I'm really excited about this program tonight. And I hope that you all have a great time with it because frogs and salamanders are some of the best things we have. But in particular, this program, we're going to talk about what exactly amphibians are, which, for our intents and purposes, are going to be salamanders and frogs. We'll talk about their life cycle, some of the adaptations that make amphibians amphibians, the importance of amphibians, and some of the threats that they're facing, as well as conservation efforts that are being made to mitigate those threats. Finally, we'll go into some actual ID. We'll cover 5 of the common frog species that you'll find in Southwest PA and 7 of the common salamander species. And at the very end, I will have some resources that you can take a deep dive to learn more about ID of the various salamanders and frogs throughout PA as well as the world, and some of the ways that you can get involved in some citizen science projects. And at the very end, I'll have plenty of time, or I'll stick around for as long as I need to for answering questions. I will try to keep an eye on the chat throughout this. If you do have any questions, let me know. I do have a lot of material, so I'm going to try to focus on getting through this at the appropriate amount of time, but I will keep an eye on the chat to the best of my ability. All right, so what exactly are amphibians? To start, I'm going to pull this up. So this is a phylogenetic tree. And what this is it's a branching diagram that it represents evolutionary relationships among species and their common ancestries. And this is going to be a very simple tree, but at each of these branching intersections here, we can call these red dots nodes. And where these nodes are represents a point of divergence, where the last common ancestor splits into 2 or more distinct lineages. And this very little simple phylogenetic tree, I'm going to have some creature way off here at some point developed a vertebral column. This is like 540 million years ago. Some sort of organism developed a vertebrae surrounding the spinal cord. Then this would kind of continue on, and eventually we would get some of the things like jawless fish, which include hagfish or some that we might be more familiar with, lamprey. From there, jaws would have developed, and we would have had cartilaginous fish. Those started showing up about 485 million years ago, and bony skeletons about 419 million years ago. And that's when we get a lot of the like bony fish that we can think of. So at some point, 4 limbs began to develop on these bony fish. And now this would allow the fish or fish-like organisms to survive in very shallow water environments. And it's theorized that approximately 375 million years ago, some crazy shallow water predator fish with a backbone and 4 limbs decided to take a stroll on land. From this common ancestor, it's believed that eventually we would get amphibians. And we have in the fossil records from like 370 to 360 million years ago, fossils that are very similar to modern day amphibians started to appear. Now, all other tetrapods, which are animals with 4 limbs, kind of split off with the formation of the amniotic egg. So the amniotic egg, it increased the number of membranes that surrounded the embryo, and that really allowed for adaptation of a terrestrial lifestyle. And from here, again, this is very simple, but from here we started seeing a lot of other splits. But for our program, the focus is this line right here. So amphibians have 4 limbs. They shared an ancestor with a creature that developed 4 limbs, but they split off from all other vertebrates when the amniotic egg was developed. So they have a few traits that really kind of define them, which means amphibians are 4-legged animals that usually have an aquatic larval stage that undergoes metamorphosis. Um, Oh, am I not sharing a screen? Hmm, that's interesting. It's saying that I'm sharing. Oh, okay. Yeah, so I've got in the chat that some people are not seeing the screen and that most are seeing it. Okay. Okay. As long as people can see the screen, I'm going to continue on. Okay. So now back to this. So they have an aquatic life larval stage, a larval stage being the beginning stage, the juvenile stage, and at some point they undergo metamorphosis. Now, metamorphosis is interesting because this is actually kind of where the term or the name amphibian comes from. So amphibian it comes from a Greek word that looks like this, and we can pronounce this amphibios. And if we split this apart, we have amphi and we have bios, which means double life. So amphibians live a double life, or one life in water and one life on land. Now, what this looks like is with frogs, we have an egg that will develop into the larva, which we know as tadpoles. These tadpoles are gilled, which allow them to breathe and get oxygen in a water environment, and those gills are internal. That's going to be an important differentiation between salamanders. So those gills are on the inside. You really don't see them. And then eventually it's going to develop and metamorphose into a froglet, which kind of shares some of the characteristics of the tadpole stage with the long tail. But at this point, we have four limbs, then we have a young frog, and finally an adult frog. All in most frogs, it's around like 14 weeks that they stay as a tadpole, but there is definitely some that stay much longer. For instance, bullfrogs, they can stay as tadpoles. They'll overwinter, usually at least 1 year, but some of them it takes like 3 or 4 years before they're finally ready to transform. Salamanders are going to be very similar. We're going to start with that egg, and then we have a larva, and the larva actually has external gills, and that's what gives them those little frills. Here's a really good view of those. So those are the gills, and then finally we have the adult up at the top here, and the adults are usually terrestrial, but not always, and that means that they'll be out on the land. And what's interesting is sometimes they have lungs, just like the frogs develop lungs, and a lot of them, though, which we'll talk about later, do not have lungs at all. They breathe through their skin. Um, when it comes to there's a lot more variability in the timing for salamanders, like when they metamorphose. Some are larvae just for like 2 or 4 months, some are larvae for 2 to 4 years, but then others, which is really interesting, actually never undergo metamorphosis. So this is something called neoteny. It's a trait of our common mud puppy or the axolotl in this picture. So essentially, it never turns into a terrestrial adult. It always has those larval traits. So it has external gills and usually pale coloration. This retention of like juvenile characteristics is interesting because some neotenic species can actually be induced to transform in a lab setting or through hormones, hybridization with a salamander that does go through metamorphosis, or just selective breeding, which is the case with a lot of axolotls. Sometimes you'll have people that their axolotls will metamorphose into a terrestrial because either they were hybridized with tiger salamanders or they have a hormone thing going on. But then some salamanders are even crazier and they are just direct developers. So this is actually the case of a lot of our lungless salamanders, which we will see later, where in the egg, they essentially undergo metamorphosis and they come out as little mini adults and then they get bigger and bigger. And then fire salamanders, which are a species in Central Europe that have a lot of subspecies. Some of those subspecies are viviparous, which means that the eggs stay internal within the female. And some will then basically lay the larva with the external gills in water. She gives birth to them. But some of the subspecies actually let the larva develop further and they come out as little mini adults. They give live birth to little miniature adults. So there's a lot of diversity when it comes to salamanders. So again, amphibians, we're going to go through some of the traits here, are four-legged animals that undergo metamorphosis. They also lay eggs that require a moist environment. They are not amniotes. They do not have all those protective layers that help them keep them from drying out. So instead, when they get laid, they're generally really, really small, but there's this gelatinous outer layer that swells with water to protect against predation and desiccation. And salamanders also have permeable skin, and this allows for cutaneous respiration. Essentially, they are breathing through their skin. Most salamanders have no lungs, and 95% of their respiration comes from just their skin. And this means that they really need to have moist environments, but this skin ends up being very, very delicate and is easily clogged by debris and oils, especially from our hands. So you're going to see a lot of photos where the salamander or the frog is in someone's hand, and you really have to be considerate about that. You have to make sure your hands are wet with leaf litter, or preferably don't pick them up. And you'll notice that the person who took this photo and whose hand this is me. So I'm guilty of this. But we do need to kind of consider the health of the salamander throughout this presentation. So don't necessarily pick up amphibians because you could damage their skin. They do have protective mucus glands, so they'll actually have two different types of glands. You have mucus glands that kind of keep everything moist and protect them from pathogens, and they'll also have poison glands. Most don't have poisons that will affect us, but they still will have these very glandular skins. Now, oh no, my laser pointer thing's stuck in the, there we go. All right. Finally, the other big thing for amphibians is they're ectothermic, aka they're cold-blooded. They have very low metabolic rates. And one of the reasons why a majority of species are found in warmer climates is because they really can't tolerate a lot of cold. But there are some exceptions. For instance, the wood frog and the spring peeper, which we'll see some close-ups later on, they can actually enter this torpor hibernation-like state where they've figured out a way to metabolize or to like send their water into a very specific spot and protect their bodies and their organs from ice crystal formations, essentially like pumping themselves full of antifreeze. And it can kind of interrupt the oxygen to these tissues and withstand temperatures below freezing for upwards of 200 days in some cases. So you'll actually have wood frogs and spring peepers that can kind of freeze and thaw, but most of them generally just hide underneath leaf litter or at the bottom of ponds, and they enter a hibernation-like state to survive just breathing through their skin. So then we'll go over some types of amphibians. Obviously, we have old Kermit the Frog, swamp Kermit the Frog, baby Kermit. Oh, there are actually other types of amphibians. So there are three. We've only talked about two, but there are three. So we have frogs, which are in the order or the group Anura. And Anura means it's Greek for without a tail. And this includes frogs and toads. The distinction is all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So toads are kind of like a subsample of frogs. And throughout the world, there is estimated to be about 7,000 species. Salamanders are the other one. They are in the order Caudata, or more recently, it's kind of being called Urodela. So Caudata is Latin for tail, and Urodela is Greek for evident tail. Caudata is essentially all extant or still living, so the opposite of extinct, all extant and extinct or fossil specimens of salamanders. Urodela is just the extant salamanders. So just the salamanders that are still around or from recent times. And the reason why there's this distinction is some of the fossil records might be different lineages. So all this to say, if you have an old field guide, it'll probably talk about caudata. If you start seeing some of the newer stuff, it's going to be going through calling this order Urodela. Regardless, it's estimated to be about 760 species worldwide. And the third amphibian class is Sicilians. This is Sicilian is Latin for blind ones, and the order is Gymnophiona, which is Greek for naked snake. These are just the little cryptic or hidden worm-like creatures. They live most of their life hidden in the ground or in stream beds of tropical regions like South and Central America, parts of Africa and Asia. They're nowhere near Pennsylvania, so we won't be talking about them anymore. They're really cool creatures. There's estimated to be only about 20 species, but they're really, really hard to study. So if you're interested in them, highly recommend looking into them some more. But as far as these species counts are, you're going to find wide varieties and ranges estimated. These numbers in particular are based on the IUCN. So if you find other reports, just know that it is kind of argued, and there's some distinction on should we include subspecies as actual species, all that kind of stuff. Now, why should we care about amphibians? One way to think about life or habitats or nature is through selfish ways. So, one of those selfish ways is ecosystem services. Now, these are services that are components, or well, sorry, these are what components from the ecosystem do for us. Why should we care about this stuff? Well, it's because they do something for us. Now, oh, sorry, the frog. I do want to answer that question. That frog was actually back in. Had a question of where did I get this cute frog picture? This one is a Cope's gray tree frog juvenile, and that was hiding in a little leaf in a pond at the University of Tennessee's trial gardens. They had a little experimental trial gardens, and it was just peeking through. So anyway, yeah, I do love that one. Back to ecosystem services, though. There we can kind of divide this into four things. So, like, why should we care about this? Well, it has some sort of cultural significance, and that could be recreation, spirituality, inspiration. These could be provisioning services where we're getting food, fiber, medicine from the organism or ecosystem, and regulating services. They are controlling pests for us, they are providing pollination events. And finally, support. They are just providing this ecosystem a healthy cycle through nutrient cycling or soil formation. And so when it comes to amphibians, they have a vital part in each of these. For cultural significance, there's historical significance. The second plague of Egypt was frogs. There are the Egyptian goddess Hecate is depicted as a frog-headed woman or just a frog and represented fertility and birth and rebirth, which probably ties into the metamorphosis and large scale at which frogs and tadpoles will emerge. Salamanders have this myth and legend associated with fire and were said to be able to control or create fire. And this is likely because if they have a tendency to seek refuge in a wet log. And if that wet log is thrown onto a fire, all of a sudden these salamanders would escape out. And so that created this myth of salamanders were born from fire and could withstand it. Modern day, we have things like commercials. I remember the Budweiser commercials with the three frogs, whose apparently these are their names. It was this is Bud, this is Wise, and this is video games, storybooks, and my personal favorite, the 50 pesos banknote from Mexico. So this started to be in circulation in 2021. And can I just say that we need to step up the game on our dollar bills. We could start putting some really cool wildlife on there. I love this thing. This is so cool. Um, Also, herpetology. So this is the study of reptiles and amphibians. This name, so herpetology is reptiles and amphibians, and it comes from the Latin word for creeping, and then study. So it's the study of life that creeps. But even like amateur herpetology, I've never not found a frog and had the whole group get excited. This little girl, it was actually another Cope's gray tree frog. She found that, I mean, the whole group was super fascinated with it. It's always exciting whenever you find a frog or a salamander. If you go out looking for this stuff, it's actually the activity is called herping. So you're actually going out to look for amphibians and reptiles. And I absolutely love this meme because it's very true. Because a lot of times you're looking for this stuff in the dead of night in areas like forests and wetlands. And so you just find weird things happening at weird times, and you're just there with your headlamp, just looking for frogs. Provisioning services. There is a very big market for food, frog legs, especially with major consumers being countries that you might not think, like France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Singapore, and of course the US. Chinese giant salamanders, these are actually critically endangered in the wild, but there is a large industry of farm raised stock that are sold for food. And some of these stock is actually received government support for reintroduction efforts. There's varying degrees of success with this. But the big provisioning service that we get from amphibians is medicine. So these African clawed frogs, this is crazy. These were used as rapid pregnancy tests up until like basically from the 1940s until about 1960, when the immunological tests started become widely available. But what would happen is essentially a sample of the woman's urine would be sent to a lab where they would inject this frog with the urine sample. And if that urine had the pituitary hormone, HCG, present in it, which, if it's present, is a sign that the woman is pregnant, if that hormone is present, it would cause this female frog to ovulate, and eggs would be visible within about 12 hours. This test was 93 to 99% accurate. And HCG is still what we use today in most modern pregnancy tests. And what's crazy is this actually replaced another animal test. They were called A to Z tests. And these would take multiple days. And they actually involved rabbits or mice. Same thing. They would inject the urine in there, and then they would actually have to kill the rabbit or mouse to look at the ovaries. But it was the same idea. And this test, the frogs could be reused. And since then, African clawed frogs have been studied quite often. But also, the mucus glands and all these like poison glands on these frogs and salamanders, they have peptides. So these just unique little compounds and molecules that we are just barely beginning to understand. There's so much potential with these peptide secretions, and it's actually something that's already been studied is how to easily create synthetic derivatives and synthetic versions of these. So it really means that there's limited need to capture frogs to keep obtaining these peptides once it's been found out that they're useful. For instance, this lovely guy, this is the Australian green tree frog. If you were into the frog pet trade, you might have also heard it as the dumpy tree frog, which I think is an unfortunate but appropriate name. This had a compound called carulatide extracted, another peptide, and it's actually proven effective in treatments to stimulate gastric and biliary and pancreatic secretions, as well as other like certain smooth muscle malfunctions. So it's got medicinal and therapeutic value. The phantasmal poison frog is secretes a very, very powerful poison, and a chemical was peptide epibotidine was derived from this, and it was a compound that was shown to be very, very powerful painkiller. And it's a non-opioid painkiller, so it is potentially non-addictive, and it's effective in lessening nerve pain, which opioids tend to be ineffective against. Unfortunately, this compound itself is likely too powerful to be used by humans safely because the dosage would be very, very small. But derivatives from this compound are showing to have therapeutic value. So this is the kind of research that we are likely to get some amazing medicine from. But we'll see later that a lot of these critters are endangered. So we might lose them before we even discover what benefits we could get. Salamanders are interesting because they demonstrate the potential to regenerate complex structures. They can regrow entire limbs, a tail, eye tissues, and even substantial parts of brain. So this is the brain, and you can see it regrowing in this study that was done, as well as parts of the heart and other parts of the nervous system. So research into these pathways could yield incredible results for human health. Regulating services, our big one is pest control, especially when it comes to mosquitoes. So a study was done in 2008 that looked at the eastern mosquito fish, which is a freshwater fish that's native to the eastern US, but it's been introduced to multiple places as a potential mosquito control. It's a very good predator of larval mosquitoes, which are aquatic. And so they looked at these mosquito fish and compared them to the larval stage of a mole salamander and the adult aquatic stage of the eastern newt. And what they found, this is a graph from the study. So Gambusia holbrookii is the fish, and here is the mole salamander larva, or the larval mole salamander. So Gambusia, the mosquito fish, consumed like over 3 times as many mosquito larvae, which is why they've been introduced all across the world. They are a known mosquito larva eater, but this has resulted in some ill effects. In a lot of those environments, the mosquito fish is now considered an invasive species and has caused other issues. And even though they didn't necessarily go on the same standard as the Gambusia, these two, each one was capable of eating like 200 to 400 mosquito larvae per day per individual. This is very important to consider when looking at where these salamanders are found. So these salamanders are going to be in areas known as vernal pools or ephemeral pools. They're seasonal bodies of water that are usually devoid of fish because they dry up for large portions of the year. So if these are the only things, these tend to be the only amphibians that are the only vertebrates in this habitat. They are the main mosquito population control. So in areas without fish, this is our main source of pest control for mosquitoes. And as far as supporting services, in aquatic ecosystems, amphibians tend to be key detritivores, consuming decaying organic matter, especially tadpoles and the larval salamanders. They will eat whatever they can get a hold of. This helps recycle nutrients. They can be top level predators. Amphibians control insect populations and play vital roles in regulating the food web, and a lot of intraspecific predation. So the top level predators would be interspecific. Intraspecific is cannibalism, especially with egg masses. This isn't important. I mean, it helps reduce competition for resources, kind of stabilizes population dynamics. So they're really good at regulating aquatic ecosystems. They are also a significant source of biomass, so just mass. Uh, there's a lot of salamanders out there. We don't necessarily see them unless you look for them, but there's a lot, which means that they are eating a lot and they are providing a lot of calories. This was always kind of talked about as ranger lore, but this species right here, the eastern redback salamander, this ranger lore that I'm about to talk about was recently backed up again by a study in 2024. So it's always argued that these salamanders are the heaviest organism. Like if you took all of the redback salamanders out there in the Northeast and put them on a scale, and then took all the white-tailed deer and put those on a scale, the salamanders would outweigh all the deer. And there is some truth to that, especially in a forest. So, this one study where they looked at mark and recapture surveys. So, salamander was captured, it was marked, usually by clipping the tail because it will grow back or doing something to mark that individual, and then surveying again to try to recapture the marked individuals. So they looked at all these mark recapture studies from like 2013 to 2019, and they estimated that 5,300 salamanders for every patch of forest the size of a football field. So every football field of forest in the Northeast has over 5,000 of these guys. This would put them on a biomass scale close to white-tailed deer in forest. That is a lot of mass. That's an important part of those forest ecosystems. So, again, why we should care about amphibians? They provide all these things for us, for the environment, for the ecosystems. Why do I care about amphibians? Without them, summer nights just would not be the same. I am going to, on this next slide, hopefully video plays through on your all's end. Hopefully I set that up right. But this is truly, like, I couldn't imagine summer nights not being like this. Didn't do it on my side. All right. Current state of amphibians. Honestly, it's quite dire. Um, Over 100 species have gone extinct since 1980. Estimates actually range anywhere from 90 to 200 species have gone extinct, and most of them are threatened anyway. They are the most threatened vertebrate class. Over 40% are either critically endangered, or just vulnerable. It's primarily due to habitat loss, alteration, fragmentation, novel or new diseases, including BD or Batrachochytrium dendrobatus, which is a fungal pathogen. It started wreaking havoc in Australia and then Central America. And around the mid 90s, it's really spread everywhere. It's been detected in over 500 species. And there's another fungal disease called B. sal. So it's actually the same genus, but it's salamander vorans or salamander devouring. This primarily targets salamanders, whereas BD would be any amphibian, and it causes skin lesions. It's causing rapid population declines in Europe. It is not here in North America yet. Other diseases like ranavirus and Perkinsia are becoming more prevalent. Chemical contaminants. So amphibians are bioindicator species, which means they can indicate whether an ecosystem is healthy, mainly due to their sensitive skin. So chemical contaminants from agricultural runoff or improper disposal practices really harm amphibian populations. They're also sensitive to an increase in UVB radiation. UVB is the high energy radiation from the sun, and it's linked to damaged skin cells and all that. This is particularly bad in regions with thinning ozone layers like Australia, New Zealand, as well as high altitude areas. So portions of the Rocky Mountains are vulnerable. Species in the Rocky Mountains are vulnerable to this increase, as well as some areas in South America. Introduced species are a problem for a lot of amphibians. For instance, American bullfrogs. These have been introduced worldwide. Uh, these prey on native amphibians. They compete for resources. They can easily spread diseases like the chytrid funguses that we just talked about. Trout and other fish, especially game fish that are stocked in lakes and streams for fishing, they'll eat amphibian eggs and larvae and even adults. And they can easily disrupt aquatic ecosystems, as well as overexploitation, primarily the pet trade. This can be a serious threat. It's a multi-billion-dollar market that still runs in part with wild caught specimens, especially brightly colored amphibians. So if you're into the pet trade, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I just always be responsible with where these animals are coming from. Um, Captive bred is preferable, but even then, you want to look into the facilities because some of these captive breeders, it's only the second generation that are actually captive bred. So they just are still wild catching animals. Um, Climate change is going to be devastating for amphibians. They're going to be very sensitive to this, especially changes to the hydro period or when is water available. So water retention in streams and pond is going to be particularly important for amphibians breeding in those vernal pools that are going to dry up, or intermittent streams. So they really rely on hydro periods that were already pretty specific. And climate change can lead to shifts in phenology or the timing of life cycle events. And if that causes, so if it warms up in the wintertime a little too soon, it could cause them to come out and start to try to breed. But then, if we still have that late winter cold storm that comes through, it could freeze all those animals and they might not be able to survive because they weren't prepared for it. It's not all doom and gloom. There's always hope. There are plenty of conservation efforts going on. One of the best things and first things that you can do is just increase awareness, which you're already doing by being part of tonight's lecture. In 2019, the Eastern Hellbender became the state symbol of PA. It's related to the Hellbender. You might have seen these uh, things in some of the national parks, these signs saying not to move the rocks, not to stack the rocks. This is a very important thing to not do because these rocks create little holes, and it's very important habitat for the hellbender. These holes are called interstitial spaces. They need them for nesting. They also, it's crucial habitat for a lot of the microinvertebrates in aquatic ecosystems. So just knowing how to treat the environment, because something as innocent seeming as stacking rocks can actually be a very detrimental activity for especially hellbenders. A lot of partnerships and conservation efforts are being formed, including partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. I'll actually link you to these partnerships with my follow-up email, so hopefully if you're interested in these, you can take a look more. But their mission statement, forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians and reptiles and the places they live. Their members include state and federal agencies, conservation organizations, pet trade industries, universities, individuals, energy, all sorts of partnerships have been made through them. Global amphibian and reptile disease conferences to start increasing awareness and connectivity on studies where they can do disease surveillance. The Amphibian Foundation, which was started in 2016 specifically for conservation of the frosted flatwood salamander, has since grown to foster partnerships. They create education programs for kids and adults. They actually have a master herpetologist certification course that you can take online. The Mid-Atlantic Center for Herpetology and Conservation was founded in 2010 and is a nonprofit that does all sorts of advocacy and education. And the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as state level organizations, are always important and integral and willing to become awesome partnerships for universities and other non-governmental organizations. A lot of restoration and preservation projects going on. For instance, the Wyoming toad, which is considered extinct in the wild, but there are a lot of captive breeding and reintroduction efforts going on. Some of them are very successful, and a lot of organizations are just preserving land for these reintroductions. The federally threatened California red-legged frogs are showing signs of return to the Yosemite Valley after a 50-year absence from a reintroduction. So after they were reintroduced, they are actually showing signs of being thriving in those areas. And then in our own neck of the woods, the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is active in acquiring and preserving vernal pool habitat, such as Wolf Creek Narrows Natural Area in Butler County. They were also the first to acquire land in what is now the Jennings Environmental Education Center. That's owned by the PA State Parks, but they're integral in the acquisition of the initial property. They also do landowner outreach, where a Western Pennsylvania Conservancy biologist could work with the private landowner and help the landowners ID vernal pools and catalog wildlife and hopefully protect these areas. Disease surveillance is an important thing that is done by a lot of universities and governmental agencies doing any sort of capture study. They are usually also swabbing for diseases, and these samples are tested either within that organization or sent to pathology labs that are monitoring for those novel diseases that we talked about, especially BSAL. There are a lot of efforts and to kind of connect each other and monitor for this because it's not here yet. So this fungal disease, BSAL, is not in the US, but there are some lab studies that show that if it gets here, at least 80 of the 140 species here, at least 80 of them are at least can be infected by this, and some of them could suffer significant losses. Speaking of disease surveillance, Park actually created the Herpetofaunal Disease Alert System. This is a way for you, if you see a reptile or amphibian that looks like it's got something wrong with it, it's covered in some white scales, or it's just, it seems like it's got an ulcer on it and it's sick or dying. You can actually take photos of it, record where it is, and send it to this email. And then they will report it and forward it to the appropriate agency. So this is actually a very important citizen science tool and has been instrumental in discovering emergent diseases and spread and new cases. All this can kind of just take some photos, be alert of your surroundings. If it doesn't seem right, send it to them. Um, Speaking of citizen science, there is an awesome one going on still. This is the Pennsylvania Amphibian and Reptile Survey and a state-sponsored Atlas project launched in 2013. This is a joint venture between the PA Fish and Boat Commission and the Mid-Atlantic Center for Herpetology to try to really catalog the diversity of reptiles and amphibians in Pennsylvania. It's a standardized thing. If you've ever done the Breeding Bird Atlas, it's the same idea. So we've got these rectangles called quads, and those quads are divided into blocks, which with each quad having 9 blocks. And the goal is to try to have 10 species of reptile and amphibian per block, or 25 per little square. This is something you can take part in. You can get on the PARS website, which I'll send an email out, and help contribute because it's still going on. We haven't even hit the halfway point with the quads. The blocks are just over the halfway point. So this is a great way. It's just recording the amphibians and reptiles in the areas. iNaturalist and Frog Watch are additional citizen science tools that you can look into. So now, hopefully, we have a better understanding, a foundation for what amphibians are, why we should care about them, what their state is. So let's kind of take a look at frogs in Pennsylvania. And before we get to Pennsylvania, just worldwide, again, we have about 700 or 7,500. In the US, it's about a little over 100. And in Pennsylvania, there's 18 recognized frog species. Southwest PA, we're looking at about 11. So where would you go about finding these frogs? Basically anywhere with water. Lakes, swamps, creeks, fast-moving creeks. This was actually a trail. This isn't even a creek. So just anywhere where you might have water, you'll probably find some frogs. It's more important to think about when to find frogs. So this infographic was produced by Penn State and shows some of the very common species, and I'll share this in the follow-up. But it shows you when they're breeding. And how do we know when they're breeding? Well, luckily frogs talk, and they talk loud, and you can actually use those calls to identify them. Frogs do have different types of vocalizations. Males are primarily the only ones that make calls. So males can make advertisement calls, which is the, hey, look at me, I'm right here, and I want to get your attention. And that's either for courtship, so that is to entice nearby females, or for territorial means, and to tell nearby males, this is all mine. And sometimes frogs will actually combine these into one single call. A good instance of, or a good example of this is the coqui frog in Puerto Rico. It's gets the name because the call actually sounds like coqui, coqui, and the co is thought to be the territorial, and the key is the courtship. So that whole thing is actually simultaneously trying to bring in the females and tell the males to stay away. And if a male enters their territory, they'll actually have encounter calls to really say like, "Whoa, things are getting serious." Some female frogs may actually make reciprocation calls. This is very uncommon though. And then both sexes will actually make release calls, which is when male, if it's to tell a male who's grabbed them that, hey, I'm not interested. So both sexes can make that noise. And then they also have distress calls. And these are usually loud squeaks in response to predator activity. But frog calls are going to be very important. We'll listen to some of them. This these are the species based on the current PARS survey results. These are the species that you're likely to find in Southwest PA. And in particular, we're going to be talking about 5 of them. These are the 5 most common based on the PARS survey currently. Up first, we have the American toad, Anaxarus americanus. Some of you may, or if you have an old field guide, may have learned this as Bufo americanus. So Bufo was always kind of considered a wastebasket genus. A lot of things were just thrown in there. This new genus, this kind of represents the North American toads. Most of them are going to be in this. Now, your toad, it's a big old plump guy. He's got dry looking skin, very rough, warty. And in particular, the American toad male will be calling, so they'll be breeding around April through July. Their length is about 2 to 4 inches. And for ID, really, it's that plump shape. The fact that it's probably the one that's going to be furthest away from the water too. And once you really get a look at it, though, you may want to start taking note of these two structures. So there's going to be a cranial crest, which is a raised angular portion just behind the eyes, and it'll either be kind of L-shaped or a sideways T shape, and they will be just in front of the parotid gland. Now, the parotid gland secretes toxins. It makes the toad taste really, really bad. And in American toads, these two do not touch. Or if they do, it's just like a tiny little bit that touches. Also, the warts, you only have 1 to 2 warts in each of these dark spots. So they're going to be very big warts. And where you have the black splotches, there's only 1 to 2 per dark spot. And it's important to think about these to distinguish them from the Fowler's toad. The Fowler's toad is much less common in our area, but it is still present. And the Fowler's toad, the crest touches the parotid gland, and the warts are smaller. So you're going to have 3 or more per dark spot. And as far as their call, it's very long. It can go on for 20, 30 seconds, and it's kind of a trill, this musical trill. All the audio is going to be coming from this book called The Frogs and Toads of North America. I will link to that book afterwards. It's made in part by Lang Elliott. It's awesome. It actually comes with an audio CD if you can pick up a new copy or a used copy that still has the CD. So I am crossing my fingers that this will play. I tried it a million times before and it worked always, but send a chat if you're not hearing anything. So that is a very truncated call. It played on my end, so hopefully it played on everyone else's. Oh, I got a chat. Let's see. Oh, dang it. It says that it's sharing it. I will make sure to link to audio on the other side. Oh, it just seems like we're having some spotty issues because I've got it worked and it didn't work. Well, I apologize for those that it didn't work. I will promise to send an awesome follow-up email. But our next frog is the spring peeper, Pseudacris crucifer. Pseudacris is Greek for locust-like, and crucifer is Latin for cross, which we'll see why in a second. These are some of the first to breed. So they will actually start breeding as early as March in our area, even earlier further south. And they are small. They are only about an inch in length. Going to be light brown overall, but they have distinct dark markings. Up first, you have a brown line or a Y between the eyes. And then probably more importantly, you have a complete X on the back. So these two in combination with the size can really help you ID the spring peeper. It's also often found on the ground or in low vegetation. It's almost never climbing on trees. So that's another good sign, is this small little frog low to the ground. And it makes a peep. So the name crucifer for cross and then spring peeper for the call. It's very repetitive too. And they breed again, so you're going to hear this call March to April. However, there is this idea called autumnal recrudescence, this really long term for basically saying the fall is a lot like spring. So birds will oftentimes get confused on a fall day that it's early spring and they'll start doing their breeding songs again. Same thing with the spring peeper. So you'll actually hear this call late into fall on a nice balmy day, or even in the winter. If they've thawed out, it'll actually kind of start, the male will start calling again. So you should hear kind of a clear, monotonous single note. And so we had a few in that example there. And this is one that's kind of fun because if you get close to a pond where you have a lot of spring peepers calling, they'll stop. Everything goes silent. And that's true for most frogs. But this one, you can kind of get them to come back up again if you mimic it. So you can just do just a short monotone whistle, repeat, and just repeat it, and they'll actually start back up again. It's really fun to do. I love the spring peeper. Wood frogs. This can be a lot of people's favorites because it's got some really cool facial markings on it. Now we are into lithobates. So lithobates are our true frogs. This was formerly Rana, Rana. So if you have old field guides or old resources, it'll say Rana sylvatica. Lithobates is now the genus for the true frogs of North America. And it's Greek for one that treads on rocks. So this would be the one that treads on rocks in the forest. And its breeding season is also very early. It's actually earlier than the spring peeper up here. This is another one, just like the spring peeper. This is the frog that I had that was frozen. So these will be out about in the forest as we get into our first little bits of thaw. And it's a bit bigger than the spring peeper, which was only about an inch. These are 1.5 to a little over 3 inches in length. They are going to be light brown like the spring peeper, but they have distinct facial markings. In particular, you have a dark mask around the eye. Some people call it a bandit mask. And the upper lip is white, which is nice because it contrasts really well with that mask. You can kind of see it really well right here. You've got this white upper lip. And these are found in forested wetlands and vernal pools. So any wet forest, you're really going to see these guys. Again, the breeding is going to be early, so it should be starting up soon. And it's just interesting. It's like clucks and chuckles, occasionally interspersed by these harsh grunts. I when I had to when I was in a herpetology class a long time ago and I had to memorize all the frog calls, I used to say my mnemonic for this one was it sounds like a bunch of like witches cackling in the woods or conversing in the woods. Anyway, we'll see. It's a very unique sound. Some people will also say it sounds like mallards or ducks quacking. Staying with lithobates for the remainder of the frogs here, we have American bullfrog. Catesbianus is unfortunately just it's named after a guy. So nothing really fun with Catesbianus, but lithobates, Catesbianus, breeding season, we're getting into summer now, so June to August, and they are big, 3.5 to 6 inches. I think the record's like over 8 inches for this. Green to brown and large. At this point, we can kind of start talking about the tympanum. So the next two species, the tympanum or the ear, is generally pretty evident, and it's useful because you can actually tell males from females. So males have a tympanum that is larger than the eye, and females, it's about the same size as the eye. So in this case, we have a male, and in the next one, we'll see a female. So here's a female, and it's about the same size. And as far as IDing these guys, they have a prominent post-tympanic ridge. So that little ridge right there just kind of highlights the tympanum. That'll be important for the next species too. Interestingly enough, if you pick these up, sometimes they go limp and just act like they're dead. They're not. Sometimes they'll squeal and then go limp. They have a fun call. So I always heard my mnemonic was always jug of rum. Is it sounds like they're saying drug of rum, jug of rum. Until one day someone's like, oh, it sounds like lightsaber noises. It's like, how did I never hear that? So let's see what you all think. that's the American bullfrog. And we're going to compare it with the green frog. Now, green frog, Lithobates clamitans. Clamitans is Latin for cry out. So the one that treads on rocks and cries really loud. Breeding season, a little bit sooner than the bullfrog is when they'll start, but then they'll continue till the bullfrogs end as well. They're smaller than the bullfrogs. So it's like 2 to 4 inches, but the coloration can be fairly similar. They're green or brown. So it can kind of get difficult to tell these apart unless you know the trick. So they also have that prominent tympana, but if you notice, you've got that post-tympanic ridge, just like the bullfrog, and this ridge that continues on. So it splits. So we have the post-tympanic ridge and a dorsolateral ridge. And that's going to be mimicked or duplicated on the other side here. So it splits and continues down the length of the body. And if you notice, we can compare the two. So we got green frog over here, American bullfrog over here. We both have that post-tympanic ridge, and then we have the dorsolateral ridge on the green frog. So if that line continues on down, that's a really good indicator of a green frog species. And that is going to have one of the fun calls. It's very short but loud. It will carry quite a distance, which is why its species is clamitans is to cry out, but it just sounds like a banjo being plucked. This is a great. And again, these the audio recordings that I used came from the Frogs and Toads of North America. It's a really cool book. It's kind of old. If you can find it, it's got a CD with the songs in it. And now we're going to get into salamanders. So salamanders of Pennsylvania. Let's back up, and we've got about 750, 760 species in the world. But this is where it's kind of cool. So on this diagram, it's kind of showing you the heat map of species. So caudata, now Uridella, salamanders up top here. Notice the heat map. It's in North America. For the frogs, it's the tropical regions, especially South America. But the epicenter of diversity, the hot spot for diversity for salamanders is actually North America. So again, salamanders, frogs, and especially the south, like the southern Appalachias, that is a hotbed for salamander species diversity. Like 7% of all global species occur just within the southern Appalachias. And in Pennsylvania, we're no slouch either. We got 200 species in the US, and over a tenth of them are found in Pennsylvania, those species. And in Southwest PA, you can potentially find 19 of those 22. So Pennsylvania is a great state for salamander diversity, and it's all just trying to find them. And where you need to look, vernal pools. That's the big key for these guys. So you want to find these temporary ponds, wetlands that dry up later in the summer. Shaded creeks or ponds are also a good source. Uh, you're only going to find certain species in large bodies of water. So don't think about lakes, think smaller. Also, just moist, mossy forests. So any areas with like all those rocks that are just covered in moss, that's where you want to look for these guys. Now, you can actually try to create some vernal pools, and I'll try to share some resources with that. It could be a pretty hard endeavor, but just kind of promoting some wet areas in your own property could be helpful for salamanders, as well as creating some of their habitat piles. So they love to be under rocks and logs. You just got to lift them up appropriately, and you got a salamander under them. Or in this case, rubber toys that look like salamanders. But they're hiding under there. As you lift these things up, though, it's very, very important to put them back. So put the rocks back, put the logs back, And if you had the salamander and you picked it up, or even if you didn't pick it up, you don't want to put the rock right on top of it. So you do want to move the salamander to the side and then place the thing back down so the salamander can find its own way back underneath that cover item. It's going to figure it out, but what we don't want to do is accidentally crush it when we put these items back on. I would also avoid rotten logs because salamanders tend to avoid them. They, again, have very sensitive skin, and some of the chemicals released during the breakdown of wood is actually irritating to salamanders. So, very rotted logs tend to just have insects. Here's the salamander species of Southwest PA. We've got quite the diversity of different families as well as different life cycles. And in particular, we're just going to cover 7 of them. It's almost like 8 because this red spotted newt's a twofer. But up first, we have the spotted salamander. So this is in the genus Abystoma, which are the mole salamanders, and they get that because they are underground a lot. Maculatum just means spotted. These are very large bodied, kind of oily black on the top with very, very conspicuous yellow to yellow orange spots, various amounts all over the head, the body, the tail. And for the length on the frogs, we just talked about the length. But for salamanders, we have to think about 2 different lengths. You have the snout to vent length and the total length. Now, the snout is the nose, and the vent is where everything is coming out, the cloaca. The cloaca is on the underside or the ventrum of the salamander, just in front of the base of the tail. So, snout to vent length would be this. We got the snout to about the base of the tail, whereas total length would include the tail. Now, why would we want 2 separate measurements? Well, salamanders can sometimes drop their tail or injure their tail, or mainly in research in those mark and recapture studies. So, if a scientist picks up a salamander, sometimes they will clip off a little bit of the tail for DNA. It's going to grow back, and that's one of the reasons why sometimes salamanders can break their tail. It's going to grow back, but it takes some time. So a more standard measurement is going to be the snout to vent length because that's not going to change. Whereas the tail might get injured, parts of it might break off, and it's going to add additional length. So it's an important measurement to obtain, but the snout to vent length is kind of the standard thing. It's going to be the most repeatable. So with that said, these can be quite long, especially with their tail. They are widespread through Pennsylvania, especially in like a mixed hardwood forest that has some conifers or some pines. But you hardly ever see these things because they have a short surface activity period, like when they're actually above ground. And that is just mid-March to mid-April. So just about 1 month is when you can see the adults. And the males will arrive to a pond first. Um, and it's usually like the first like really, really good rainstorm that we have in March. These guys will come out in droves at night and they will cross the roads. At good spotted salamander population areas, you'll have a blackout of these things crossing the roads. And then the females will follow. And when she's ready to deposit the eggs, they form these giant egg masses. And the egg masses, when she first lays them, are only about an inch. And then it absorbs all that water, and you end up with an egg mass that's like 5 to 6 inches. It's just this jelly mass of like 60 to 200 eggs. They kind of come in different colors. If it's green, it's actually an algae that's symbiotic with them. But if you've ever looked for a pond that has, especially these vernal pools, that has no fish and a lot of leaf litter at the bottom, and you might see these egg masses in mid-April. The rest of the time, they're underground in burrows. So the other one that we're going to talk about is the red spotted newt, and this is the one that I said was going to be kind of a twofer. So this is the eft stage. This is something we haven't talked about yet, but this is kind of this interesting subadult stage. So in the red spotted newt life cycle, we have egg, and then the gilled aquatic larva, and then that metamorphs into an eft, a red eft, EFT. And this subadult has lungs, and it's got this rough, it doesn't have scales. It's not a lizard, but it's very rough, dry skin and bright, bright orange with these red spots. This stage can last for like 2 to 7 years. They just kind of wander off into the world. They're very terrestrial. They've got those nice breathing lungs. They can go explore everywhere. If you go out into especially eastern PA into like the Pocono swamps, there will be so many of these guys just out and about strolling around, no care in the world about predators because this bright coloration is a warning. These are toxic little guys. So they have tetrodotoxin, which is a neurotoxin. It's the same thing that's in pufferfish. And there's enough toxin in one of these individuals to kill about 250 mice. So animals learn very quick to leave these guys alone. And so they just wander around. On average, it's probably about 3 years in this stage. But again, sometimes upwards of 7 years. Till finally they're like, I'm ready to grow up. And they metamorphose one last time into the adult stage. What's interesting is this adult stage has lungs. It can still breathe through its skin. It has lungs, and now it's aquatic. So it's going to live in a pond. It's got this really awesome tail for swimming, and it's going to be about, it's a little bit longer than the F stage, especially the males. And you're going to find them in ponds that have heavy leaf litter substrate. These are more permanent ponds. So they're not necessarily in vernal pools, but they might utilize vernal pools for breeding. But they'll overwinter underneath the ice. So if the pond's deep enough, you'll actually see these guys just kind of like floating there. And occasionally a little bubble comes up, and they're just underneath that ice. The red spots are still present, they're not as visible, and it's approximately a tenth of the toxin. So instead of 250 mice, it's about 25 mice. So still toxic. They're also very sexually dimorphic during breeding season, so you can tell the male and the female apart. These, if you ever go with someone to like sample newts, sometimes you'll like put in the fish net during breeding season, and you'll pick up like 50 individual newts in that single net. And you can then try to figure out which ones are the male and the female. So we have two, we got the female on the top here, the male down below. Mating is anywhere from like March to June. And in the males, they're the ones that kind of change a little bit, not the females. And the males, their hind limbs begin to swell and become noticeably larger than the forelimbs. It's kind of noticeable in this female, but like big, giant, swollen hind limbs. And then the tail fin also swells and just becomes very, very smushed and tall. And the cloaca, which is that vent that we talked about, it also becomes it's swollen and protrudes. You can even see it on this guy right here. Finally, if you actually had it in your hand, you picked it up, you would see nuptial excrescence. They're like these little black tire tracks right here, and the black toe pads. It's a keratinization of the skin, and it is essentially for gripping. So, sorry, I guess I forgot the arrows. So there's the cloaca, and finally here's these nuptial pads or nuptial excrescence. And what this is, it's actually allows the male to grip the slippery female in the water during amplexus, which is in amphibians when the male grabs the female. This is also in frogs. It's known as amplexus. And so the male, after the female is receptive, or before she's fully receptive, he grabs her around the neck. And if she isn't receptive, he'll stay in this position for like several hours until finally she's either gets away or agrees. It's a weird world for the amphibians. So those were the first two salamanders. All the remaining ones belong in this family called Plethodontidae. These are the lungless salamanders. Over 500 salamanders are in this family. So about 65% of all salamander species are in this one family. The adults actually lack lungs. They do not have lungs. They conduct respiration through their skin and partially through some tissue lining on the inside of the mouth. So you'll tend to find these in moist environments. They aren't very aquatic. There are definitely some exceptions, but they're terrestrial. They're out on land. The first one is the northern dusky salamander in this genus called Desmognathus. So Desmognathus is Greek for jaw ligament because these guys this genus has very bulky, beefy looking mouths. Their head is very just beefy, and the ligament, the jaw muscles, just kind of extend out to the side of the head. And the northern dusky salamander, um, the coloration can vary quite a bit, so don't fall in the trap when you're trying to ID salamanders of just sticking with the color, because you'll have lighter individuals, you'll have darker individuals. The pattern that we'll discuss in a second tends to be a bit more vivid in the younger individuals than the adults. So instead, you start looking for other traits. This, as an adult, it's only about 2 inches, but the desmogs, the Desmognathus, these you can also just call them duskies. The forelimb, so this front limb, is much smaller compared to the hind limb. Most of our other salamander species will have very similar sized limbs, but you can definitely note the size difference in the desmogs. And then for this species, it has a pattern right here on its back that has a wavy line. So this dorsal pattern, or the pattern on its back, is very wavy. And the tail is highly keeled, which is like you pinched it at the sides and pulled up. So like the keel of a boat, the point on the bottom of the boat, their tail points up like this. And they're also going to be found near water. They want to be near a creek or near a pond, always near water, compared to our other common desmog, the Allegheny mountain dusky salamander. This one, it's a very short thing. It's a very short salamander. It's about a half an inch shorter than the northern dusky on both the SVL and the TL. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but when it comes to salamanders, it's a decent amount. The other thing with desmogs, so this one will also have a forelimb that is smaller than the hind limb. The other thing that helps you identify this genus is right here, you have a pale line. So from the eye to the jaw, there will be a white line on almost every desmog. You will see this line. So that pale diagonal facial stripe is diagnostic for this genus. And then for this species, you're going to look at that dorsal pattern on the back, and you have this really nice stripe that tends to be ochre colored or yellow. And then it has chevron patterns that may or may not be visible. So these little arrow-like patterns run right down the middle of that dorsal stripe. And then the other big thing is the tail is round in cross section. So it is not keeled, it's round. And it's also very terrestrial. So if you're not near water and you got a dusky salamander, it's probably the Allegheny Mountain in our region and not the northern dusky. So again, northern dusky has this keeled shape, and this one has the round shape. The tail shape on a salamander can be a very important ID trait. Unfortunately, it's hard to show it in 2D, but especially with these confusing desmogs, there's a lot of other species in this genus, especially in the southeast. Tail shape can be very important. Now we're in Eurycia. Um, what's fun is there's argument on what this genus actually means. It's possibly a mythological reference, but no one really knows for sure. And this northern two-line salamander is another very common one that you're going to see. This genus, the brook salamanders, tend to have very just slender bodies and they're relatively long. And the northern two-line salamander definitely fits that description with very, very slender shape. And then they have dorsolateral stripes, so stripes on the side of their back with dark spots in between. So stripes, two of them, and little spots. So northern two-lined salamander, and there's going to be none of that diagonal facial stripe. These are going to be underneath rocks most of the time, especially near sandy creeks. So if you got a sandy creek, you might get some of these. This one tends to be a lot of folks' favorite. This is the northern slimy salamander. Now we are into the genus Plethodon, which is the one of the more common genuses of woodland salamanders. And this can be a fairly large salamander. And plethodons tend to be slender, like Eurycia, but this one breaks that mold. It's a very bulky one. It tends to get confused with a mole salamander, which is what the spotted salamander genus was. And especially females, because they can get rather large, and this could be confused with a spotted salamander, but it doesn't really have yellow spots. It's more of a white spot. These will be very abundant in mature forests, and you mature forests with like coarse debris, the very large logs. When you overturn them, you'll see some of these. And then an exceptionally round tail. In these photos, you're going to really see like it's like almost a worm. But the fun thing that usually makes these some of folks' favorite is so they're Plethodon glutinosus, and glutinosus means sticky, and they actually secrete a sticky glue-like substance from their tail and some parts of their lower back. You can actually kind of see some of the leaf litter sticking right here. And this glue can actually temporarily bind the jaw of a predator, allowing the salamander to escape. So if like a snake or what have you grabs a hold of this, bites down on the tail, it's just gonna, its mouth fills up and it can't move well. And this slimy salamander can break that tail off and run away and get out. And eventually it's gonna grow the tail back. The other plethodon that we'll talk about is the eastern redback salamander. This is the last salamander that we'll talk about tonight. Plethodon, by the way, is Latin for full of teeth. They don't have true teeth. And then cinereus is ash or ash colored. So it's like the ashes in a fire. This is probably our most abundant salamander, especially in the woods. It's active on the surface as early as January in Pennsylvania and will continue to be active into December. So there's like only a small amount of time where this doesn't even, or that it's underground. And even then, if it's a warm couple of days in the middle of December, it will come out. So these are very, very common, definitely the most abundant and commonly seen in North America or in the Northeast. And they generally, though, are solitary. So occasionally when you lift up a log, you might see a couple of these, but they're pretty solitary. They're pretty territorial. So it's just every time you lift up a log, you find another one. What's interesting, though, is there are three recognized color morphs or phases of this salamander that are quite different to look at. So you have your striped morph, which is the basic one. But the thing is that color, it can be red, it can be grayish, it can be bright yellow, but it will always, so it's not the color of the stripe that matters. It's just the fact that it's a stripe because it will always have black bordering its sides. So that's the big distinction for the stripe morph is you have color. It's like someone took a paintbrush right down the middle here and added some sort of color. Then you might have the lead-backed phase where it's just dark all around. So this one missed the paintbrush. And a lot of times there's a little bit of flecking, like bronze. So maybe the paintbrush was taken and kind of done like that to add a little bit of bronze flecking. And then finally, there's a very rare red morph that will have the color go all the way on the side too. This is very, very rare. So here's the problem. These all can be very confusing. All this can be very confusing, especially when you open up the field guide and see other plethodons. At this point, you're going to start to have to figure out what the underside of this salamander looks like. And it can be very daunting, but it can be done. You can, if this is something that intrigues you, you can start to learn how to ID these traits. Just know that of these common ones, they're pretty easy to get, and there aren't too many confusing species. And we have an awesome resource with iNaturalist where people love to look at photos. So getting good photos of these things and submitting them to iNaturalist. There's even a project in iNaturalist that's trying to catalog all the different variations of this species of eastern redback salamander. So it's a fantastic resource. I'll talk about it again in a second, but just so you know, if hopefully this has piqued your interest a little bit, if you want to take a deeper dive, there are plenty of resources out there on amphibians. So I'll kind of cherry picked a few, especially for the Northeast, and I'll go over that as we're wrapping up here. If you're looking for just a good field guide, the first guide from Peterson's. This is the smallest one. These are tend to be for early uh, naturalists or just people trying to get into it. What's nice though is it can fit in your backpack pretty well. Otherwise, if you want a bit beefier, I highly, highly, highly recommend the Peterson Field Guide to Reptiles and Amphibians of Eastern and Central North America. This one was updated not too long ago. It is an awesome field guide for both amphibians and reptiles. And if you can find a copy of Amphibians and Reptiles of Pennsylvania, this is also an awesome book that goes into deep dives into the natural history of each species. So the Peterson's Field Guide is great for ID. This one is great for ID as well as just learning about the habits and habitats of these awesome creatures in Pennsylvania. If you want some websites that are helpful for ID, highly recommend checking out that PA HERP survey. So the Pennsylvania Amphibian and Reptile Survey, PARS, not only is a great citizen science project that you can get involved with, but has ID character, or they have some ID help for the different creatures. And you can kind of search the map to figure out what should be in the area. So if you're in Southwest PA, trying to figure out what is likely to be around. PA Herps is a good online source. And then here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission is in charge of the protection of our amphibians. And you can go on their website and they have nice little species profiles for each of them. If you're interested in learning your frog calls, can't recommend this book enough. It's also great for ID. Highly, highly recommend this book. If you can't find it though, Lang Elliott also has a website called Music of Nature. You can find more from his awesome audio recordings. You can also get on Zeno Canto or the Cornell Lab Macaulay Library. Both of these have recordings of frog calls that you can view the spectrogram of and just listen to try to learn what these sounds like, what these sounds are. iNaturalist is an awesome, awesome resource for frogs, for really any organism. But if you aren't familiar with this, it's so Seek is made by iNaturalist if you've ever used Seek. But iNaturalist, what I really love about this is when you submit an observation, people can agree or disagree. So in this case, someone submits a lungless salamander. They aren't sure what of these salamanders it is. They just got maybe hopefully a couple of photos of it and they just put in that it's a lungless salamander. So it's in that family Plethodontidae. And then you have people that can agree. So someone's like, oh, wait, it's a northern dusky salamander. And then someone agrees with them and now it's research grade. So this is actually data that can be used in various things. In this case, they didn't know what frog or toad it was. They just knew it was definitely a frog or toad. So they just did order a Nura. And someone from that photo was able to figure out that at least it's a cricket frog. And maybe the photo isn't good enough or they didn't get the characteristics to figure out what type of cricket frog, or maybe you can't tell unless you hear it call. But this is a great tool to not only hopefully ID whatever you find, but learn the ID process. You can actually comment on these, and a lot of the people are pretty nice. So if you comment like, "How did you know?" I've gotten a lot of good responses from folks because these people that are responding could be amateur naturalists, they could be professional herpetologists. If you're looking for a bit more, if you want to learn more about Frog Watch in particular, it's another citizen science project. We have another program, February 27th, that's online that will talk about Frog Watch in particular. And with that, do we have any questions?